Let's talk about The Forever War by Joe Haldeman. This is a Sci-Fi Masterworks copy in the new print. It was number one in the original series from 1999, 2000, and Peter F. Hamilton, writing the afterword here, says it deserved to be. It should have been. I would not have previously thought it was that high on the list of sci-fi classics. By that I mean so central, not so good, but so central. You think Dune, Foundation, Rendezvous with Rama, Ringworld, perhaps, if you want to go into the new wave. Maybe whatever other authors you can think of, Edgar Rice Burroughs, but Joe Haldeman, The Forever War. One thing that affects that is that he is mostly famous for The Forever War, and that can be a problem for people who are mostly famous for one book, is it can seem less significant achievement. Having read it, I think it really does deserve to be up there in the core canon of classic sci-fi. I'll read the blurb. Private William Mandela is a reluctant hero in an interstellar war against an unknowable and unconquerable alien enemy. But his greatest test will come when he returns home. Relativity means that for every few months' tour of duty, centuries have passed on Earth, isolating the combatants ever more from the world for whose future they are fighting. This is a 1972 book, and it is written by, or 1974 possibly, I thought it was 1972. It was written by a man who had served as a combat engineer, winning a Purple Heart in Vietnam in the late 60s. This is a Vietnam War book. It is pretty clearly about Vietnam, but it's not just about Vietnam. It is, in the set, David Drake talks about the Hammer Slammer series, and talks about, at some level he's working out, there's therapy in these books for him, he realises a lot later. And though I wouldn't want to presume that for Joe Haldeman, there's similarly a way that there is, whatever else he's talking about, he is processing and putting out his experience of war. It is, it's interesting that Joe Haldeman is listed with, people like Jerry Pournelle and Gene Wolfe and David Drake as great military sci-fi writers. I've not read anything else by Haldeman. This is great military sci-fi. It's very different to, say, the Ashkin War parts of the Book of the New Sun, or the Hammer Slammer series, or the RCN series by David Drake. This is much grittier in one sense of the word. It's much more realist in one sense of the word, and it aims for a very different effect. And now the kind of blurb does tell us what's going on. This is a tough novel. This is a sad novel in many ways for a lot of the time, about a man who loses his life, essentially. He goes off to war, but every time he comes back, things are different, and it's not just that they are a bit different, it's that, people are dead, it's centuries, everything's changed, society's changed. There is some fairly trenchant commentary on social change, which isn't necessarily political. It becomes obviously, perhaps as much as anything, higher order philosophical than about any contemporary politics to Haldeman. But just looking at the way in which you can't go home again as a soldier, he feels like. He evidently experienced that, I think. You can't go home again. You're always separated by your experiences. And for him here, he's talking about the fact that William goes back and everything's changed. He also looks at the way, and this is a point Gene Wolfe makes actually in an introduction to Hammer Slammers by David Drake, that these soldiers are not dehumanized by the experience of war in the way that we perhaps, in a fairly rhetorical and polemical way, might fear or like to think. They remain profoundly human, but war is friction. There's a gag there in here about Clausewitz and that quote. War is friction, and it grinds down on the people involved, not to the point of dehumanizing them, but to the point of causing their humanity in some ways to be exposed for good and bad, quite obviously and openly. There's something about the frustrations and futilities of war that would have been felt, particularly by the Vietnam generation, but I'm sure at many other times in human history by many people. There is a tiny bit of the what appeals or attracts. There is something about sometimes something about relationship, the closeness and intimacy that comes through that trauma. But it is largely, I think, a grim read. A small criticism, that's not really a criticism, is that for a lot of the runtime, I was just thinking, my word, this is tough. This is well written. It's written in first person, and William is a attractive narrator, even when he's flawed, because he is profoundly human and sympathetic. One knows how he feels. It's beautifully written often, not in the sense that there is a lot of high prose, but in the sense that there is just a lot of effective and elegant and well put together prose. It's economic and quick and pacey. It doesn't take a long time to do lots of things. It is really sci-fi. This is the funny thing, is that this definitely you'd think is new wave sci-fi. It's by a Vietnam War veteran. It might be cast fairly easily as a satire on Vietnam. It's not really a satire on Vietnam. It's about high themes and concepts, morally and ethically, but it's also very much speculative in terms of saying what kinds of technology might be viable and useful in future wars. Talking about what weaponry might become useful. The stasis field is great, for instance, as a concept. The kinds of explosives you need when you can just have incredibly powerful explosives, the Nova bombs, when you can create miniature suns in terms of heat. But is there a level of too much where actually it doesn't become useful? Things which do relate to our actual experience in warfare too. So there is an actual, and he was I think his degree was in astrophysics, I believe, something like that. His academic background was there. So there is real hard sci-fi in there, but it is married to a new wave sensibility thematically and stylistically. It doesn't offer very many easy answers. The couple of times it does, no, I won't comment further on those. The couple of times it does offer easy answers are less satisfying than the tough and thorny things, which can sometimes be quite depressing. But nonetheless, it is ultimately, for all I say, that side of those, that's hard, and I've given a couple of small critiques. It's a really, as I say, lovely book to read, well-paced, and it's also ultimately profoundly humane. It is pro-human. It is not, that does not mean, not all books that I think people think are all about humans are very humane. But this book likes humans. It wants humans to be happy and thrive. It looks at bad and hard things and tries to work out how we respond and how we cope with trauma. And it gives us a narrator who, though flawed in some ways, is actually, in a very small and quiet way, I think sometimes quite heroic and engaging to read and positive to read. It's hard to say more perhaps without you spoiling, because you end up saying, well, the back half of the book, this stuff's happening, this is how the relativity time problems work out, this is what I thought about this character and this particular sub-arc. So much happens in this book for 240 pages because of this time dilation issue. But I can't say very much more because of that. But I will say it's a very good book. I do not think that if you are into good, thoughtful, emotive, clever sci-fi, say something like A Canticle for Leibowitz, I do not think you'll regret reading this if you haven't. And it's short, so you're not going to regret it for long if you have read it. If you have read it, tell me what you think in the comments, and I'll see you next time.